Imagine surviving the most brutal nightmare of World War II, only to discover that true devastation was waiting for you at home. A piece of paper, a simple note that destroyed everything you fought for. That's exactly what happened to Frank. The war took 3 years of his life. Filthy trenches, friends exploding at your side, the constant smell of death. And what kept him alive? The promise of returning home, to the arms of the one I loved. But fate had other plans. Stop now and think. How long? Could you stand living a lie? Because that's what Frank discovered when he opened that door. The silence that screamed, the house intact but empty of life. And then, that note. The handwriting was familiar. The words, devastating. Frank, if you're reading this, each line ripped through his soul like no enemy bullet ever could. While he bled on foreign battlefields, someone stole everything he had at home. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was proof that sometimes the most dangerous enemy doesn't wear a uniform. What that note revealed was worse than any horror of war, because in war you know who your enemy is. At home, you never imagine that the person who should protect you would be capable of destroying you. Today you will learn the story of this soldier who survived the Nazis, only to be defeated by a few handwritten lines. A story that will make you question, who would you be able to wait for? And most importantly, who would wait for you? World War II created heroes on the battlefields but destroyed many of them when they returned home. Frank was just one of thousands. The sound of the bombs eventually stopped, but the words in that note continue to echo today. Have you ever imagined yourself fighting for years, watching friends die, going through extreme hunger and cold, all for the promise of a reunion that might never happen? Frank did it. He survived the impossible. And for what? To find a note that revealed the most painful truth a man could face. What would you do if you found out that while you were risking your life for your country, your own life was being stolen? How would you react when you realized that every love letter you sent from the front, every promise to return, every dream of reunion, everything was based on a lie? Frank didn't just face Nazis, he faced human nature in its rawest form. And what this note revealed goes beyond simple betrayal. It revealed something about all of us, about how fragile we are in the face of loneliness, fear and uncertainty. When you finish listening to this story, you will understand why so many veterans came back from the war different. It wasn't just the bombs and gunshots that transformed them, it was the tickets, the absences, the lives that went on without them. In the next few minutes, you will discover exactly what was written in that note, why Frank sat silent for hours staring at those words, and the shocking decision he made next. A decision that no one expected and that will shake everything you believe about forgiveness and revenge. This story is one of the most impactful we have ever told on this channel. Stories like Frank's are disappearing, along with the generation that lived through World War II. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel now, so we can continue rescuing these memories before it's too late. Words have power. Words can change destinies. But have you ever imagined what it would be like to have your life completely destroyed by just a few lines written on a piece of paper? That's exactly what happened to Frank, an American soldier who faced the worst of World War II and survived to tell the tale. Or at least he thought he would survive. Frank spent 1095 days at the front, 3 full years of seeing death up close. 3 years dreaming of the moment when I would set foot on American soil again. 3 years of nurturing the hope of hugging the person I loved again. And when that moment finally arrived, when he finally opened the door to the house he had fought to protect, he found a small piece of paper folded on the table. A ticket, just like that. A note that would change absolutely everything. Can you imagine the sound of silence? That deafening silence that says so much more than 1,000 words. It was this silence that greeted Frank when he entered the house. The same walls, the same furniture, the same photographs, but an inexplicable void. And then, that paper. The story I'm going to tell today is not just about a soldier from World War II. It's about something much deeper that is within each of us, It's about how our greatest enemies aren't always wearing different uniforms than we do. Sometimes they are closer than we imagine. What was written on that note? Prepare your heart, because the answer is far more devastating than any fiction could invent. It's one of those truths that cuts like a razor, that forever changes the way you see the world and the people around you. Frank survived the Nazis, survived hunger, the cold, the physical and mental exhaustion of war. But would he survive the words written on that little piece of paper? This is a true story, a story that few know, but that everyone should hear. A story about loyalty, betrayal, and the true meaning of courage. Because sometimes facing the truth requires much more courage than facing the enemy on a battlefield. And remember, as you listen to this story, thousands of veterans bear similar scars. Invisible scars, but they hurt much. More than physical scars, scars that were not caused by bullets or grenades but by words, due to absences, for silences. Frank was like you and me, an ordinary man, from a small town in the interior of America. He worked as a mechanic, had a wife he had loved since school and a daughter who was only 2 years old when Pearl Harbor was bombed. The world he knew, the future he planned, everything changed in a single day. In 1942, Frank did not hesitate. He enlisted like thousands of other Americans, driven by a sense of duty and love of country that may seem naive today, but at that time was all that mattered. He traded his mechanic's tools for a rifle. He exchanged hugs from his little daughter for a heavy uniform. He exchanged the security of his home for the constant terror of the European trenches. Can you even imagine what it's like to spend 1095 days in fear of dying every second? Frank didn't count the days. He survived them, one at a time. Nights when it was so cold that your fingers turned blue inside your gloves. Days when the mud from the trenches reached your knees. Horrible moments in which I saw friends I had been friends with for weeks, men with whom I shared letters from home and childhood stories, being torn apart by bombs or shot by gunfire. The only thing that kept Frank sane was a photograph, a simple photograph, folded and worn from being handled so much. In it, his wife held their young daughter on her lap, both smiling at the camera. Every night, before going to sleep, he would look at that image and whisper to himself, "I'll come back, I promise I'll come back." During those 3 years, Frank received exactly 27 letters from home. Each of them was read so many times that the folds of the paper threatened to tear. Every word was a thread that connected him to the life he had left behind. Every line was a promise that no matter how long it took, she would be waiting for him. The last letter he received was dated June 1944. After that, silence. Frank wrote several times but never received a response. He tried to convince himself that it was just the chaos of the post office in times of war, that your letters weren't arriving, that her letters weren't reaching him, that everything would be okay when he could finally go home. And how could it be any different? They had promised each other. "Till death do us part." Sacred words, an oath made before God and everyone they loved. Frank didn't doubt for a second that his wife would be waiting for him, no matter how long it took. Here's the cruelest detail. While men like Frank fought for their lives and their country, life went on for those who stayed. The cities didn't stop. The days didn't wait. Hearts didn't freeze in time. And sometimes that meant people moved on even when they shouldn't have. In all those days at the front, Frank never imagined that his greatest battle would not be against the Nazis. His biggest battle would be against something much more devastating: human nature, the ability we have to adapt, to forget, to replace, the fragility of the bonds that we swear to be eternal. May 8, 1945. The day the whole world breathed a sigh of relief. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. The Nazis defeated. On the battlefields, exhausted soldiers threw their helmets into the air, hugged each other, cried like children. Frank was among them. He had survived the impossible. But surviving the war was just the first step on a long journey. Home. First came the months on crowded ships crossing the Atlantic, then the endless military bureaucracy, medical exams, the superficial psychological assessments that couldn't even begin to understand what these men had experienced. Frank wanted only one thing: to return to his city, his home. his family. When he finally stepped onto American soil again, Frank felt something strange. The country he had fought for seemed both familiar and completely foreign. The people on the streets were smiling, living their normal lives, worrying about things that now seemed so trivial to him. How could anyone care about the price of bread or the new model of car when they had seen men die in droves? Frank took a train, then a bus. With every kilometer he got closer to home, his heart beat faster. He hadn't told her he was coming back. "I wanted to surprise you." He imagined his wife's face when she opened the door and saw him there, finally back. He imagined how his daughter, now 5 years old, would react when she saw the father she had barely known. Would she recognize him? When he finally got off at the station in his small town, something immediately seemed wrong. In war, soldiers develop a sixth sense, an almost animal-like ability to sense when something is not right, even without knowing exactly what. And it was this instinct that made the hairs on the back of Frank's neck stand up as he walked through the familiar streets. The city was different, not physically, but there was a strange energy. Frank noticed the looks. People recognized him but quickly looked away. Some waved from afar, but no one approached to welcome the war hero. It was as if everyone knew something he didn't, as if everyone shared a secret too heavy to mention. Frank's house was at the end of a tree-lined street, a simple wooden house painted white, with a porch and a small garden in front. As he approached, his heart almost stopped when he noticed that there were no curtains on the windows. And the garden, once so well cared for by his wife, was abandoned, overrun by weeds. Still, he continued, one step after another. The door wasn't locked, another sign that something was very wrong. In a small town like this, people rarely locked their doors, but his wife had always been cautious, especially when alone with a small child. When Frank opened the door, he was greeted by a silence that seemed to have physical weight. The house was clean, but empty of life. The furniture was there. Some clothes still in the closet, photographs on the walls. But there was a thin layer of dust over everything, and the unmistakable smell of a closed house. It was then that he saw on the kitchen table an envelope. His name, handwritten on the front, in the handwriting he knew so well. His wife's handwriting. Frank sat up, his legs suddenly unable to support the weight of his body and the realization that was beginning to form in his mind. With shaking hands, he opened the envelope. Inside, a note, a simple piece of paper that weighed more than all the military equipment he had ever carried. What do you believe was going through Frank's mind at that moment? Share your opinion in the comments. Frank's hands were shaking so much that he almost dropped the note. War veterans often develop a tremor, a little nervous tic that never goes away completely. But at that moment, it wasn't the trauma of war that made his fingers tremble. It was fear, a fear far deeper than any he had felt on the battlefield. The handwriting was unmistakable, those gentle curves in the letters, the way she always slanted slightly to the right. Frank would recognize his wife's handwriting even if he was blind. How many times during those 3 hellish years had he reread his letters until he memorized every word, every comma, every tiny detail? That handwriting represented his home, his life, his reason to keep breathing when all he wanted to do was give up. And now those same letters held words that made her heart clench like it was being crushed in a vice. "Frank, when you read this," the note began. And then, like a bomb being dropped, "If you read this." If. A simple 2-letter word that carried a world of meanings. If, not when. If, implying doubt. If, suggesting that she was unsure if he would return alive. Or worse, if he would come back. "I couldn't wait." The next 3 words burned like live coals against his skin. Frank read it, reread it, as if he could change its meaning. Through sheer force of will, as if I could rearrange those letters and transform them into something less devastating. The note continued, each line a new blow against everything Frank believed in, everything he had fought for. It was not a welcome note. It was not a celebration of his return. It was a farewell, a confession, a betrayal put into words. While Frank fought against enemies that could be seen, identified, and could defend himself against, a silent battle was taking place at home. A battle he was not prepared for. A battle that I didn't know I was losing with every day I spent away. After a year of not hearing from you, the note said, everyone said you were probably dead. The War Department had a policy. If a soldier was reported missing in action for more than 6 months, their families were notified of the likelihood that they would never return. It was not a confirmation of death. It was a cruel limbo, an uncertainty that gnawed at the souls of those who waited, day after day without answers. Frank had never been missing. He had been briefly captured, yes, held prisoner for nearly 2 months. But after that, he started writing regularly again. His letters, however, never arrived, lost in the chaos of war, just as his wife's answers never reached him. Grief is a strange process, the note continued. You cry for someone who might still be alive. You try to move on while a part of you refuses to let go. It's like living with a ghost. And then came the part that completely destroyed Frank, the part that made his entire world fall apart. John has been by my side this whole time, supporting me, helping with little Mary, doing what you asked him to do before you left. Take care of us in case something happened. And it did, Frank, or at least we believe so. John. Frank's best friend since childhood, the man who had been his best man at his wedding, the man who wasn't called up because of a knee problem, the man Frank had entrusted with his family's well-being before he left. It wasn't planned. We didn't want to betray your memory, but the comfort turned into something more. And after 2 years of believing you wouldn't come back. Frank stopped reading for a moment. His hands were now not just shaking, they were shaking violently. He folded the paper, tried to take a deep breath. In his ears, the familiar sound of distant explosions, an auditory hallucination common among veterans. Only this time, the explosions seemed to be inside his chest. He forced himself to continue reading. We got married 6 months ago, Frank. We took Mary with us to Chicago. A new beginning. She's doing well, growing strong. She still talks about you sometimes, the few memories she has. John treats her as if she were his own daughter. The last lines of the note were the most difficult, an impossible request to be fulfilled. Please understand. Please forgive. We did what we thought was right at the time. If you're reading this, it means the impossible happened. You came back. And now we all have to live with the choices we made. The note ended with an address in Chicago. And one last blow. If you decide to reach out to us, please think about what's best for Mary. A soldier learns to process information quickly, making decisions in fractions of a second, assessing life or death situations with brutal clarity. But nothing, absolutely nothing in his training, prepares a man for what Frank was facing at that moment. Alone in the kitchen of the house he once called home, Frank sat for hours, staring at that piece of paper. The note that revealed the devastating truth, while he fought to survive, while he dreamed of the moment he would return to his family. That same family had moved on without him. The sun has set. Darkness took over the house. Frank didn't move to turn on the lights. The darkness matched perfectly with the emptiness he now felt. A void that no medal, no recognition for bravery could fill. 2 years. Without news. That's what the note said. 2 years of believing he was dead. But Frank had written it. Religiously. 1 letter per week, when possible. Hundreds of letters lost in the war's overloaded mail systems. Letters that never arrived. Promises that were never heard. The system had failed him. The country he risked his life for had failed his family. And now all that was left were the fragments of a life that no longer existed. Your wife. Your best friend. His little daughter, who now called another man father. All the pillars that had supported his hope during the worst moments on the front lines had collapsed under the weight of absence and uncertainty. Frank finally understood the true extent of his loss. It wasn't just a house or a wife or a normal life that he had lost. It was his complete identity. Who was Frank now? A ghost. A man out of his time. Someone who returned to a world that had already adapted to his absence. The note on the table was more than an explanation or an excuse. It was a mirror that reflected the most brutal of truths. War doesn't just steal lives. She steals futures. It destroys connections. It turns people into strangers. And sometimes, surviving physically is just the beginning of much deeper suffering. In that lonely moment, sitting in the dark kitchen, Frank faced a dilemma that thousands of other veterans would face in the years to come. What do you do when the life you fought for no longer exists? How do you move forward when the home you dreamed of finding again has turned into a strange and hostile place? The note ended with an impossible request: forgiveness. How to forgive someone for replacing you? How can we understand that, while every second of their existence was dedicated to surviving to return home, those who stayed simply moved on? And most painful of all, think of what's best for Mary. His own daughter, now living with another man as a father, a child who barely remembered him. That perhaps she had already been convinced that her real father was just a distant memory, an anonymous hero who would never return. Frank finally stood up and walked to the small bar in the room. Dust-covered whiskey bottles that hadn't been touched in months. He poured a glass, then another. The alcohol burned his throat, but it couldn't put out the fire that now burned in his chest. A toxic mix of anger, sadness, confusion, and a feeling of betrayal so deep it seemed physical. He had options. I could get the address in Chicago and go after them. He could confront the man he once called his friend. You could try to get your daughter back. He could seek some kind of justice or revenge, or I could just accept it, accepting that while the official war was over, his personal war was just beginning. A silent battle against invisible demons, against memories that now seemed to belong to someone else, against a country that celebrated returning heroes while ignoring their deepest wounds. Frank looked again, at the crumpled note in his hand. The words now blurred by the tears he finally allowed to fall, tears I had held back during 3 years of unimaginable horror, tears that no soldier should be ashamed to shed. What would Frank do next? The decision he made on that silent night would change not only his destiny, but the destiny of everyone involved in this story. What would you do in Frank's place? Share in the comments your reaction to discovering such a profound betrayal. There are moments in life that act as watersheds, moments that clearly separate who you were before and who you will become after. For Frank, that lonely night in the kitchen of his old home was just that. The war was over outside, but a new battle was beginning inside. A silent, invisible battle, but infinitely more devastating. Frank didn't sleep. When the first rays of sunlight came through the uncurtained windows, he was still there, sitting, the crumpled note in one hand, an empty glass in the other. His face no longer showed any expression. It was as if something had permanently broken inside him. Something no doctor could fix. No medal could compensate. He was not alone in this experience. While celebrations of the end of the war dominated the headlines, a much darker reality was silently unfolding across the country. Homes destroyed not by bombs but by prolonged absences, broken marriages, children who didn't recognize their own parents, men who returned different, changed by experiences that words could never adequately explain. Official records show that more than 38% of American soldier marriages did not survive World War II, a frightening number that reveals a truth rarely mentioned in history books. War continues to claim victims long after the last shot is fired. Frank was just one of thousands, men who survived hell only to discover that the paradise they fought for had disappeared in their absence. Men who bore visible scars from battle, but whose deepest wounds were those no one could see. Frank's first decision was not to drink anymore. He had seen many comrades return from the First War and drown their memories in alcohol. He had seen how they ended up, shadows of the men they once were, lost in nightmares that never ended. He could have lost his family, he could have lost his future, but he would not lose his dignity. Not after everything he's survived. The next morning, Frank did something that surprised the small town. He got up, took a shower, put on his full uniform with all his medals, and walked to the local barbershop, the place where the men of the city gathered to talk, discuss politics, share news, the place where I knew I would find answers. When Frank entered the barbershop, The silence was immediate and oppressive. All eyes turned to him, some ashamed, others with morbid curiosity, few with genuine compassion. Frank didn't say a word. He just sat in the barber's chair and asked for a cut. His first civilian haircut in 3 years. It was there, as the old barber nervously trimmed his hair, that Frank began to hear the whispers, the details that the note didn't tell. How his wife cried for months when the War Department notified her that Frank was missing. How she resisted accepting the possibility of her death. How he refused several offers from other men, and yes, how John, her best friend, really kept his promise to take care of her and little Mary. How he fixed things in the house, brought food, made sure nothing was missing. And how after almost 2 years without news, the inevitable happened. Comfort turned into affection, affection in love, a love built on the foundation of shared pain over the supposed loss of Frank. The trauma of war is not just in the horrors witnessed on the battlefield. It's in the little stolen moments, in the first step of a son that the father did not see, on the lost birthday, Christmas nights spent in the trenches as families tried to move forward with an empty space at the table. It's time, that implacable enemy that waits for no one, not even war heroes. Frank learned that day that there were no clear villains in his story. His wife was not a cruel cheater. John was not a disloyal friend. They were just people trying to survive their own kind of war. The war of uncertainty, the war of endless waiting, the war against loneliness, and perhaps that was the bitterest lesson of all. In real war, at least you know who the enemy is. You know who to fight. But in the wars of the heart, the battle lines are blurred. The sides get confused. And sometimes there are no possible winners, just different types of losses. Frank left the barbershop transformed, not just because of the military haircut replaced by a civilian hairstyle, but for a new and painful understanding of the complexity of life, the fragility of human promises in the face of time and distance, of the cruelty of a world that kept spinning, relentless, as he fought to simply stay alive. When I pass veterans, today men and women who served in distant wars, I always wonder, what notes did they find when they returned? What silences greeted them? What invisible battles are still raging? What Frank did next defied all expectations. It went against all natural instincts. It was a decision that still generates heated debate when this story is told. The next day, Frank went to the city bank, withdrew his savings and bought a train ticket. Not to Chicago, where his wife, daughter and former best friend now lived, but to the west, to California, to a place where no one knew him, where no one knew your name, your story, your pain. This is not a story about revenge. It's not a story about an angry soldier taking justice into his own hands. Surprisingly, it's a story about something much rarer and much more powerful: understanding. Frank could have gone after them. It could have caused a scene. He could have fought for custody of his daughter. He could have confronted the man he once called his friend, and no one would blame him for that. In fact, many expected just that. But during those long hours in the dark kitchen, looking at the note, something changed inside Frank. Something deep. Something fundamental. He understood a truth that few can understand. That war does not just steal lives, steals futures, steals relationships. It steals the ability to love and trust. And in some cases, it robs children of the chance to grow up with their biological parents. Frank thought about his daughter, Mary, a 5-year-old girl who barely remembered him, a child who probably already called another man daddy, a child who could be traumatized if suddenly a stranger appeared claiming to be his real father. If she were torn away from the stable life she now knew. He thought of his wife, the woman he had loved since he was a teenager. He imagined the months of anguish she must have felt, mourning for a husband who was believed to be dead, the guilt of eventually finding comfort in another man's arms, the pain of having to make impossible choices. And yes, he even thought about John, the man who promised to take care of his family and ended up becoming part of it. Frank could feel anger, betrayal, fury, but he could also, with great effort, see the situation through John's eyes. A man who probably fought his own feelings out of respect for the friend he believed he had lost. A man who, in the end, did exactly what he promised. He made sure Frank's family wasn't left destitute. This understanding did not come easily. It was not a moment of instant enlightenment or miraculous forgiveness. It was a conscious and painful decision, one of the hardest decisions Frank would ever make. And so, one autumn morning, Frank boarded a westbound train. In his pocket, not the devastating note, but a photograph. The same photograph he had carried during 3 years of war. His wife and daughter smiling. A moment frozen in time, a piece of what was once yours. Frank didn't go to California to forget. It was to start over, to build something new from the ruins of what had been lost, to prove to himself that just as he had survived the war, he could survive this loss. Years later, when he was already established as a mechanic in a small coastal town, Frank did something even more surprising. He sent a letter to the Chicago address on the note. A brief, dignified letter. No charges, no bitterness. A letter in which he said he understood, that he hoped they were okay, that he wanted Mary to grow up happy and healthy, that maybe one day when she was older they could meet again. Frank never received a response. Maybe the letter never arrived. Maybe they decided that reopening that wound would be too cruel for everyone involved. Perhaps the fear of Mary's reaction upon learning the truth was too great. But that no longer mattered to Frank. What mattered was that he had made peace with his past. I had understood that sometimes the most difficult truths are written in the simplest letters, that sometimes true heroism is not in fighting external battles, but in winning internal wars, the wars against hate, resentment, bitterness. We all have our own tickets in life, revelations that change everything, moments that force us to reevaluate who we are and who we want to be. The question is not whether you will receive yours, but how you will react when it arrives. Frank chose to react with dignity, with understanding, with a kind of love that transcends possession and genuinely cares about the well-being of the other, even when that means letting go. What would you do if you were in Frank's shoes? Share your thoughts on the decision he made in the comments. Frank never served in the army again. He never wore his uniform again after that day at the barbershop. He never spoke about the war with anyone again. But he also never forgot. The war had officially ended in 1945. But for men like Frank, it never really ended. He continued to have nightmares, startled when hearing loud noises, in moments of dissociation when something triggered a particularly traumatic memory. And now, there was this other war, the war against bitterness, the war for inner peace, a battle as real and as deadly as any he faced in Europe. Frank wasn't the only one. Thousands of soldiers returned to destroyed homes, for broken marriages, for children who didn't recognize them, for jobs that no longer existed, for a society that, despite the parades and celebrations, quickly forgot its sacrifices and moved on. Today, decades later, as the last of the World War II veterans slowly leave us, it is important to remember that their stories go far beyond what we see in Hollywood movies or read in history books. They go beyond the battles, the strategies, the famous generals. These are deeply human stories, stories about ordinary young people who overnight were ripped from their normal lives and thrust into the unspeakable horror of war. Men who have seen the worst of humanity and somehow kept their own humanity intact. This soldier, Frank, survived physical warfare, survived bullets and bombs. He survived the cold and hunger. But the real battlefield was at home, in the words written on a note, in the family that didn't wait, in the future that was stolen from him not by the enemy, but by relentless time. And yet, Frank chose not to be consumed by hate. Don't be defined by betrayal. Don't let that passage determine the rest of your life. Instead, he used the same resilience that kept him alive in the trenches to build a new life, to find a new purpose, to prove that, even when everything is lost, something new can rise from the ashes. There are reports that, years later, Mary, as an adult, met Frank. Some say it was by chance, others that she deliberately sought him out after discovering the truth. We don't know exactly what happened in that meeting, whether there were tears, hugs, recriminations, or forgiveness. What we do know is that somehow this encounter brought a kind of peace that Frank had sought for decades. Frank passed away in 1987, aged 67, a quiet man who fixed cars in a small California town, a man who smiled little but was known for his unwavering kindness and integrity, a man who, despite everything he lived and lost, never allowed bitterness to define him. His funeral was simple, few attended. He had kept it to himself, as so many veterans do. But among those present, there was a middle-aged woman with eyes identical to his. A woman who placed a rose on the coffin and whispered, "Goodbye, Father." Wars end, treaties are signed, nations move on. But the scars remain, the memories remain, the tickets remain. This story isn't just about Frank. It's about all of us, about how we react when life gives us devastating news, about the choices we make when faced with losses that seem unbearable, about our ability to understand, forgive, and start over, even when all the odds are against us. As you move on with your life after hearing this story, ask yourself, what notes have you received? How did you react to them? And most importantly, how did they make you who you are today? Wars end, the tickets remain, and we, like Frank, have a choice in how we allow ourselves to be defined. This story of Frank echoes through time as a reminder of the true meaning of courage, not just the courage to face enemies on battlefields, but the silent courage to face the truth, however painful it may be, the courage to rebuild when everything was destroyed, the courage to sometimes just move on. Stories like this are disappearing quickly. Every day, we lose more World War II veterans, and with them, their unique experiences that show us what it means to be truly human in inhumane times. Each viewing of this video keeps alive a part of this collective memory that cannot be forgotten. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to rescue these stories before they are lost forever. What impacted you most about this story? Frank's surprising decision? The complexity of human relationships in times of war? Or perhaps the transformative power of forgiveness? Share your deepest reflection in the comments. Your unique perspective illuminates aspects of this story that many may have missed and creates a much richer collective understanding. What you just watched is just the surface. There is an even more impactful revelation about Frank's fate that few know about, a twist that will completely change your understanding of this story and the true meaning of heroism. Click on the next video now and discover the complete truth that has been hidden for decades.